What's up, everybody? Welcome to Not the First Time. This is a show where we try to figure out what the hell is actually going on in the world. The premise is simple. I, Rhett, bring questions that normal people are hopefully thinking. Andrew and Cameron bring the history and political context. Together, we try to make sense of how we got here because none of us are experts. We are literally just three dudes. And we believe that understanding the past is the only way to stop being surprised by the present. Because if you understand how we got here, you can form your own opinion instead of just reacting to headlines. We've got an awesome episode ahead of us today. We're taking our conversation to this place that's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And I think a place that most people associate with cigars, old cars, a frozen Cold War communism relic, and this fella named Fidel Castro. That's right. We're talking about Cuba. And I think most Americans grow up seeing or hearing things I just mentioned, but also the headlines going on today. A lot with Trump talking about Cuba being next, imposing various sanctions on Cuba. But we want to uncover how we got here. And Cuba has been intertwined with the United States from literally like the beginning of the United States, financially, politically, culturally, even militarily. So this isn't just a Cuba story. It's a story of America too. So let's get into it.
Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Not the first time. This has happened before. We've been here before. Been here. So we're asking why? Not the first time. The podcast.
All right. Good morning, fellas. Happy Sunday. Bit of a weird new time for us to record Sunday morning. How's everybody feeling today?
Feeling great. Feeling good.
Yeah,
Heck yeah.
feeling good today. It's nice recording on a Sunday morning. It's beautiful out, and I'm already fucking anxious and ready to like yell about foreign policy. So we're off and running here on this beautiful Sunday. I do want to correct you a little bit up top there, Rhett. This is not just an episode. So we, Ekis and I, after much discussion, we were going to try to do the history of Cuba in one episode, kind of keep this succinct for our beautiful listeners, but not going to happen. We tried. The history is so cool, and really the theme of what we're going to talk about is, where we are, where we came from with Cuba, but a little bit of why we don't really know anything about Cuba. Ekis and I have been talking about it. This is one of those subjects that, as an American, we feel a little bit robbed of kind of what we've been told, or lack thereof of knowledge of this island that you mentioned is only 90 miles away. So, really excited to talk about how we got here and why this matters. And Rhett, we'll get into it a little bit, but you have a unique perspective on this because you're one of the few Americans who have been able to go there. So super excited to kind of get your thoughts on that too, and kind of break down Cuba, boys.
Yeah. Hell yeah. We'll definitely talk about, I hope we'll get some time to talk about just like time there and what it was like being there in person. It was awesome. But Ekis, like, what made you want to talk about Cuba, man?
Well, to start off with this episode, I do want to mention a quote from President Harry S. Truman. He's noted for saying that there is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. I think that quote hit me really hard, and that quote kept coming to mind when I was studying and reading into the history of Cuba, because it truly is one of those untapped, crucial pieces of not just Caribbean history or North American history, but in terms of the entire Americas, both hemispheres, Cuba is really at the center of a lot of what transpires. And I think few Americans have really considered the importance of Cuba for that. It's undeniable that the story of the American Empire is intertwined in the streets of Havana. The two countries have been tightly bound, as you said, Rhett, from the very beginning. And a few examples of just some of these ties that we're going to get into is the fact that Cuban gold helped finance the American Revolution and the nation's first central bank. Cuba's most famous patriot, José Martí, lived most of his life outside of Cuba in the United States. The first Cuban flag was designed by Cuban exiles living in the U.S. From our entire history, Americans have listened to Cuban music. Cubans have watched American movies. Americans have bought Cuban sugar and cigars. Cubans have famously bought American cars, and millions of Cubans have immigrated to Miami alone. Today, 1/3 of Miami's population is comprised of Cuban Americans. And I mean, yeah, like we can't forget to mention this that the current sitting Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was born in Miami to Cuban parents who were not yet naturalized U.S. citizens who had escaped actually before Fidel Castro's regime, so even before all that. But it just goes to show. I mean, one of the top ranking members in our government right now is direct descendant of Cuban exiles.
It's insane. I didn't know that, and I feel like that would not be as welcome today if he was like earlier on in his career. I don't know. Like,
Well, right. Well, that's kind of what we're going to try to unpack here. Like Egas and I again talked about what are we trying to do with this Cuba series, and at the end, I do want to know what there's such vitriol still in Miami, but all over the U.S. of Cuban exiles and their disdain for what happened to their country. But it's a reaction that you see from like Israeli conflict. Like it's a nationalism, but living it 90 miles away in Miami. It's very interesting. And Marco Rubio, he's a great case study on this because we're going to get into that in our later episodes of kind of where we fall with Cuba today. But kind of his opinions on it are a little counterintuitive to what you'd think if you're a prideful Cuban. We're going to get to that. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to explore is why there is this reaction still to this day with Cuban Americans.
And Marco Rubio is the perfect like microcosm case study of how complex this relationship is because he himself is a Cuban American who just recently was talking about how we might need to go occupy Cuba as a matter of national security. And so having a Cuban American Secretary of State talk about annexing Cuba itself is just again like it's convoluted, it's complex. Part of it doesn't make sense. And it's just a perfect example of how these two countries have been intertwined.
Yeah, what's new? Talking about convoluted and complex topics for us here.
That's
Just trying to wrap our head around a bunch of shit. No, it is crazy the pridefulness that Cuban people have, and also the disdain that they have for what's going on in Cuba or what's happened there in the past, and it is truly fascinating. So I'm super excited to learn from you guys about how we got to this point, how we are here today.
Well, we're gonna get into it because the history of Cuba is harrowing and I mean tragic and altogether triumphant in certain parts and altogether inspiring. And it does encapsulate the full spectrum of humanity for better and for worse in certain times, as we'll get into. And the interesting through line that I saw was that Cuba as a nation has found itself at the extreme of whatever time period it happens to find itself in. It was a bustling indigenous society, one of the most flourishing and organized before Columbus. It was where Columbus first made significant landfall. It was integral to the transatlantic slave trade. It was the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire, became the first stop of what would become a U.S. empire. At the height of the Cold War, it became a communist nation. And when the world was full of nuclear terror, Cuba was at the epicenter of a crisis that very nearly ended civilization as we know it. It did almost all come to an end in Cuba. And today, it remains a nation caught between two worlds, one of independence and self-determination, and one of constant oppression by greater powers, both internal and external. And in a world today where there are only 5 remaining communist countries, Cuba is the sole representative in North America, just 90 miles south of Florida. So we're going to dive in. Before we do, I want to shout out our main source for this episode, and that is the amazing book by Ada Ferrer titled Cuba, An American History. It is such a fantastic book. I cannot recommend it enough. Again, there's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know. This book is the perfect example of that. If you want the full story, the breadth of the story, get that book, read it. I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, it's been awesome. And it's a cool perspective of it. It's a Cuban history, but told kind of through the American lens because they are so intertwined throughout it. It's a really cool way of linking our two countries together. So yeah, couldn't recommend enough.
Heck yeah.
Before we dive in, Rhett, we wanted to see what your overall interpretation and understanding of imperial Spain might be.
Yeah, my thoughts here, Rhett, just to kind of preface you, learning U.S. history in this country, it's very British oriented. And Nikos and I, we kind of go through the weeds of it. But when you hear of Spain during this time period, what are your thoughts?
Well, I could tell you prior to starting to research this topic and read this book that Ikis just mentioned, my thoughts of Imperial Spain was pretty much just tied to Columbus, and his voyage across the sea, and thinking he landed in India and all that stuff. I had zero idea that he had landed in Cuba first. But what I've come to realize, and I couldn't just help thinking this every time I was kind of learning more and more, is the Spanish were a brutal, brutal people. Like, they were out there to get whatever they wanted, whatever was in their way. They didn't care. They were mowing down people. They were taking over land. Like, they were stopping at nothing. And I did not realize that the Spaniards were such just, I don't know, brute force, almost, I would dare I say, like, just bad people, man. Like, they wanted to get what they wanted. And so that really blew my mind, because I always had tied it to like the British Empire, to exactly what you're saying there.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. That's kind of the response I was hoping for, because we're going to go through a lot of this. But when you're a history guy a little bit, you make comparisons to other empires of history, and the Spanish are up there as one of the most brutal. The Genghis Khans of the world, the Alexander the Greats, like the damage that they took on this hemisphere it's really remarkable to kind of read through and watch. So we'll go through it. I was just curious to see kind of where you stand on Spain, but it sounds like you're going in the right direction.
Yeah, man. I mean, you said Genghis. Genghis I thought Genghis Khan, right?
We are of the Dan Carlin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are ways to say
Genghis
things, right?
Khan, man. Well, Genghis Khan, how I've always known it, is
He's Genghis.
dude. I mean,
he'll always be Genghis to us.
Genghis, bud, whatever.
What
are
are you,
Dan
Steve
Carlin?
Brule?
No.
Genghis. No, man. I mean, you hear these stories. The story that I've heard that has like stayed with me over time of Genghis Khan was taking the people that were like refusing to join his side, after raiding these villages, and tying them up shoulder to shoulder, laying them down, making a platform out of them, and having dinner on top of them while they just sat there and died. And I was like, that's fucking brutal.
Yeah, man's got to eat.
Yeah, and like, comparing Spaniards to that now, I had no idea that was like in the same realm of my thoughts, that those two things could be combined. So, to your point, yeah, had no idea.
Well, and the Spaniards ran into the New World at the worst possible time, because in 1492, Spain had just won the Reconquista, right? So like Spain was almost fully occupied by Muslim different caliphates. There's like the Umayyad Caliphate, and the majority of Spain was under Muslim rulership. Spain, of course, is a very staunchly hardcore Catholic country, and they spent 800 years. It was the entire Middle Ages. They spent fighting to take Spain back over from Muslim forces, and so they had just become a nation that was super hyper focused on religion and warfare, and making sure that their religion won, so that in 1492, when they then land in a new world with an untapped population, in terms to them, it was just they already had that 800 years of pent up warfare and religious conversion, need, that it just exploded once they finally landed. But we're going to get into that, because to begin, I always find it pertinent to begin with the people that are always forgotten about in North American history, which is the indigenous peoples who lived on that continent for thousands of years. And in terms of Cuba, it's the Taino people. Now, the earliest settlements in Cuba date back to 3000 BC. So when Columbus landed in Cuba in 1492, he found himself amongst the people who had been living, hunting, fishing, and walking on that island for literally millennia. Okay, there's a deep-rooted historical layer on the island of Cuba, thanks to the Taino, that, again, we can't forget the fact that there was a really storied culture already there. Now, the Taino were the indigenous Arawak-speaking people of the Caribbean. They had a bit of an island empire. They inhabited the Greater Antilles, which was Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas. They were sizable, really flourishing culture, total population of 1 to 2 million people, which in terms of North America as a whole, North America had more people living in it than Europe did in 1492. So we're talking about, again, a full continent of people with flourishing cultures. Even up in the Carolinas, you have the Cahokia settlement, which was a massive mega city. So there was, I mean, very sizable structures, mega cities here. These were not primitive people. Okay, they were not regressed. These were indigenous cultures that had their own political systems, agriculture, science, language, metalsmithing, origins, writing. In terms of the Maya, they had their own writing system independent of anywhere else on the earth. Um, then the famous year of 1492 happens. Columbus, who was, of course, an Italian sailing for the Spanish crown, first landed on an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. A few weeks later, on October 28th, he landed in Cuba. And at first, he thought he landed in Japan, then deduced that he was in mainland China, and he died still believing that he had found a new route to Asia. And when he was on these islands, he would claim Cuba and the surrounding islands, current day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic as new Spanish territories. And in doing so, under Spanish royal decree, he became governor of life of whatever land he decided to claim. That was part of his deal. Like Spain, the Spanish crown was going to fund his trip to the New World to open up this trade route, and the deal was that whatever he found, he was governor of life for, and that in turn became Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Cuba.
Yeah, and I mean, Columbus got a little bit lucky with Spain too. The whole thing in the 1400s was, how do we get to Europe or Asia the fastest? How do we speed up the spice trade? How can we control that? And Columbus's idea was simple, and I know we're struggling with this in 2026, but even in 1492, people did realize that the Earth was round, and for all the shit we're about to give Columbus for good reason, at least he was smart enough to know that. I'm sorry, Kyrie Irving, you're getting outdone by fucking Christopher goddamn Columbus. But the idea really, I mean, he thought he could reach Asia in 2 days, sailing west. And the Spanish, they really had nothing to lose. I forget what the exact title was, but his title that they were given was absolutely ridiculous. But it was kind of like, if you make it, great. But it was a calculation of, who cares? Let's send this guy and see what happens. And it turned out to change human history for, forever. But that's kind of where the Spanish were at the time. It was just this guy who wanted to do it. And they're like, all right, dude, here's a crazy title. Go ahead. It took him 2.5 months to get there.
Yeah. And Columbus is, I mean, you could make the argument that Columbus is maybe, I mean, other than like Jesus, like maybe one of the most famous historical figures of all time. I think everyone has heard of Columbus, no matter where you live on the planet. And he's taken on like hero status, and we even have a Columbus Day in the States. But we're putting down the marker that Columbus sucks.
Yes.
And Columbus really should be seen as a villain of history. First off, he didn't discover shit. Again, there was already people there for 3,000 years. Now, as Cameron said, his 2-month journey across the Atlantic Ocean does deserve some merit in terms of seafaring, but he wasn't even the first to do that, and he wasn't even the first European to make that journey, as the Vikings made it to North America some 400 years before Columbus. So even by European standards, he was not the first person to make it into North America.
And by all
Columbus
accounts, it seems like the Vikings, when they came over, they're finding like Viking coins in Canada and like the Nova Scotia area, showing that they were trading with the locals, not doing what the Spanish do here. So I don't know if that is a bad indicator for history, that if you treat people with respect and you try to trade with them, people will just forget you. But if you come on over and kill almost all the entire population, we put up statues in front of the fucking White House.
I mean, if you're losing the moral argument to Vikings, then you fucked up pretty bad.
I want to pause here for a sec, because I know that growing up, the thing that always comes to mind with this is that like history is written by the victors, right? And I don't think that there's a better example of that than this scenario here, to where you're talking about the Americas being civilized, like having trade routes, trading internationally, having cities. Like this was not a primitive culture that we were taught. And I think that is just that is overlooked, and I don't know that that is commonly known by majority of Americans, that this wasn't, sticks and spears and teepees. Like these were cities, and these were people running businesses and trading.
Yeah, it's one of my biggest pet peeves is when people like go to Europe and they're like, "Oh, there's just so much more history in Europe. Like the history in the United States is just so much younger." I'm like, "No, it's not. There has been established flourishing cultures in North and South America for 10,000 years, right?
Yeah.
Even in Colorado, Mesa Verde is a medieval city built into the side of a
Yeah,
rock.
it's so
Like that
sick.
it was built in 1000 AD. And even before that, in Mexico, you have the Olmecs, you have the Maya that were flourishing. And again, they had their own writing system, their own astronomy, their own math. Like these are extremely They were people. Like people are people, whether they were in Africa or India or in Mexico, and they were developing the same things. You have in some of these places, like in Mexico, have they found like examples of trade routes going all the way up from like Canada down to South America. So this was a plugged in
Yeah.
again, like you said, international structure, and it just should not be forgotten that again they weren't primitive, they weren't backwards, they were just as advanced in many ways, sociologically and politically, than some places in Europe were.
Yeah, if you want to play the historical Russian roulette, and it's interesting to think about, like, if the disease wasn't on the side of the Spanish. I mean, their horses and steel were something, but they were outnumbered. Almost from the second they got here to the end, they were always outnumbered. I mean, they took out Montezuma with like 161 Spaniards. But a lot of the damage was done was just based on they just killed people off with disease. So I've always wondered, maybe if the South American diseases affected the Europeans and it went the other way, where we would be today. But unfortunately, the disease picked the side of the Spanish, and it did just incalculable harm.
And that's a huge part of the story because we cannot understate how truly apocalyptic the introduction of Europeans was. In my opinion, I think it might be the single most catastrophic event in human history in terms of sheer human toll, even over World War II. I'm not kidding. Scholars estimate that within just the first 100 and 150 years of European contact, 80 to 95% of indigenous populations died, amounting to roughly 55 million people across North and South America. And that's a conservative estimate. And even with new technology like LIDAR and radar and some of the satellite technology we have, they're discovering like fully untouched cities buried in the Amazon that have been consumed by jungles. Like there's still fully undiscovered civilizations and cities that we haven't discovered yet. So like we're talking complete destruction of two, again, North and South America. And the few that did survive, they faced slavery, subjugation, persecution, and execution by the Europeans that were arriving by the boatload. And to continue on with this exercise, like imagine if the U.S. population fell by 90%. That would be if the U.S. went from 338 million to 34 million, which is less than the population of California spread out across the entire country, right? So a civilization cannot sustain itself when it loses 90% of its people. And the psychological damage that happens to that is also unimaginable. Because I've always wondered the same thing, Cameron, especially when you look at the Incan Empire, where Pizarro and 168 conquistadors end up taking over the entire Incan Empire. It's like, how does this happen? Well, it's because 90% of their people had been killed. Like they were already a broken, tattered ruin of what they were, and you cannot survive, you just cannot sustain yourself when you lose that many people, and so that's a huge part of this story.
Yeah, and it gets even darker because the loss of the native populations is leads directly into the rise of the slave trade. Because we killed off all the people that were working, got to find more people. And I know you're going to get into that, Ekis, but it just gets darker.
I will get into that, and again, that's a forgotten about aspect. Everyone forgets that it was the indigenous populations that were enslaved first. Again, it's not to overshadow or to undermine in any way what would happen with the Africans that were brought over and enslaved, just as horrendous, but it's often forgotten that it is the indigenous populations that were enslaved first. Now, the Spanish would conquer and settle Cuba very quickly, and in just 4 years, they built 70 towns on the island and instituted the famous encomienda system, which basically is a copy pasted version of classic European feudalism. And feudalism is what had served as the core political and societal system in Europe throughout all the Middle Ages. So this is again a medieval world that's slamming into these indigenous populations. basics of the encomienda system is you essentially give a noble a tract of land. He owns everything, including the people, and the people in turn are supposed to work on that land for the noble, and in return, the noble gives protection, resources, food, clothing, whatever they need. But in principle, this basically just became a forced labor camp. and,
Yeah.
and again, it is for this reason that the Teano have the very unfortunate distinction of being the first humans to become enslaved by European powers in the New World. And it goes back to what I said at the top of the episode, is that Cuba always finds itself at the extreme of whatever time period it's in, to the point where they're now the first people enslaved in what would become the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, and it moves incredibly quick. I'm not sure of the whole timeline with Columbus, but he only stayed in the New World for like it was only a couple months or maybe a couple years, something like that. It was a very short period of time before he sailed back over to Spain, told them of all the riches, all of the lands, all of the people that they can convert to Christianity, all the souls they can save, is kind of how they preface that, which is demonic. But the first thing he did is get an armada going, and they brought like 10 ships back over immediately to bring more and more Spanish people. So from going 1 year, you're living your life like you have for 3,000 years, and then you see a ship on the horizon, to 5 years later, now all of a sudden there's 7 Spanish towns being established, and your neighbors are being enslaved or moving. The amount of stories of like Teano people trying to just run for the forests and like establish new communities so hidden that hopefully the Spanish wouldn't find them. Just really dark, incredibly sad.
True, again,
Was
apocalyptic. Like, it is an apocalypse for them. Like, everything that they knew was being destroyed.
was this a race at the time to like conquer new lands? Like, was Columbus heading back so quick because he's like, shit, we need to do this before anybody else can? Like, were the Spaniards racing other countries at this time for expansion of their land, their religion, their oversee of government, anything like that?
It would eventually become that, but there was a really bizarre, strange deal that was made at this point, where Spain discovers this new continent, and Portugal, also being in close proximity to Spain, Portugal had explorers all over the world. So Spain and Portugal went to the Pope and are basically like, what's the deal here? Like, who gets all of this? And they cut up a deal where they literally split the earth in half and gave Portugal the rights, like eternal rights, to one half, and Spain eternal rights to the other half. And so that's why you have Portugal and Brazil, and Portugal in Africa predominantly. They had a lot of settlements in Africa, and then Spain was essentially given the rights to all of whatever this new land is. But there is a continual balance of power in Europe. One country doesn't like another country getting so powerful. So when Spain started getting all these territories, that's when you see the French, the British, and the Swedes get in there at one point. It does become some sort of like colonial race.
Yeah, but at this point, at the very, very beginning of this, it kind of was the Spanish able to run roughshod over everyone. I mean, the British make a huge appearance in the story. Obviously, we're speaking English here. But for the very beginning here, I mean, all the way to Montezuma and Mexico City, it was a lot of the Spanish. And Portuguese. And the Portuguese historically were a huge seafaring people, because they would basically run ships out of Portugal following along the coastline of Africa. And they were the first people to ever cross that far or do something like that. They were known for like their abilities on the ocean, but they would always follow the coastline, which is what made Christopher Columbus a revolutionary. Is that back then you never wanted to be so far away you couldn't see land. That was kind of the rule with the Portuguese, and Columbus sort of put that on its head by sailing in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I get that rule. I wouldn't want to be taking my boat just into the abyss.
Now, of course, all of this conquering was done in the name of God. Of course, this is God's will. And many of the surviving natives were forced to adopt Christianity or die. Now, the native Cuban population resisted this as best they could. In one famous example, there was a Taino chief named Hatue who fought tooth and nail to resist Spanish occupation. And in a well-known exchange that describes Hatue's final moments before being burned alive in Cuba on February 2nd, 1512, He's chained up. A Catholic priest asks him if he's finally ready to accept Christianity so that he might go to heaven after he's executed. And Hatway answered that he wanted nothing to do with God, and especially a God that would allow such cruelty to be unleashed in his name. The priest then asked him a final time, and Hatway replied that if Spaniards go to heaven, I would rather go to hell so as not to see such cruel people again. This is the most
Yeesh.
metal response you could ever have to that.
Yeah.
Hell
It's-
yeah, man.
It's not a popular opinion, but I'm pretty sure no person has been no one's name has been invoked to murder more people than Jesus Christ. And the Spanish are the key to that. The amount of people that they kill in the name of salvation and saving these lost souls is insane. Especially if you've actually like read the biblical Jesus. It's the exact opposite, but it's what the Spanish do in the name of God is truly atrocious. Ikas and I were talking, and I forget the name of it, Ikas. I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but the script basically that the Spanish read every time that they conquered a new land, they essentially, in such, it had to have been the most surreal, eerie thing if you could just be a fly on the wall. But the Spanish, anytime that they would find a land, they'd essentially make landfall, bring a canoe across with a notary, a priest, and the conqueror, and they would sit there and they would read this script that was essentially like, you are now part of the empire. There's 3 leaders in the world. It's the king and queen of Spain, the pope, and then the conquerors. And they basically read this script in Spanish, mind you, to a bunch of people who have no fucking idea what they're saying. But being like, you must submit to Jesus Christ, and if you don't, then or if you do, we will leave your child, your wife, everyone alone. But if you don't, then the laws of God allow us to do whatever we want. And it's like, most historians believe like they were saying this to an empty beach because these people were running for their lives. But just the idea of like, to make it official, you had to read this script in the name of Jesus is just dystopian as hell.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, it literally is terrifying. So I'm like, I don't think, again, like the example I had was like if aliens landed and then held out a script in a different language and it said if you do not accept it, like from here on out, you're now under our rulership, and if you go against it, you're going to be killed, and everything you've ever known and loved will be destroyed. Like it's literally what they were doing for these populations, and it's really truly like hard to understand again how apocalyptic it all is.
Yeah, and they were fully thinking that they were in the right here, that God truly was giving them the power to do this. I mean, the popes of this time were blood hungry monsters. And so it just kind of fed into this system of like, you're allowed to do this. So the lack of remorse from all these stories, I mean, the Incas, the Aztecs, like all these stories of these people getting completely wiped away, there's no attrition. There's no like Spanish being like, maybe we shouldn't have done that. It's very weird. But it's just because they think they were in the right.
It's crazy. You look at the humanity in this situation, and it is the furthest thing from what I would associate with, a God or Jesus or the Bible. And to take it and interpret it in that way and use it for your advantage. I mean, I guess it's not all that different than what we sometimes see today. So maybe this is the first tag of not the first time in this podcast that we get to say that the shit's still being done today, just on different levels, right?
Truly, 100%. Now, from its newly acquired colonies, Spain became very powerful, the predominant world power of the time from the 16th and 17th centuries, and Cuba was central to that expansion. By 1607, Cuba became a royal province of Spain, getting its own recognized provincial government, and this really meant that the sole purpose of Cuba was now meant to support the massive Spanish Empire. It also meant an influx of new and exciting goods flowing between the two continents. In addition to massive amounts of gold and silver, Spaniards brought back tomatoes, corn, potatoes, tobacco, and chocolate, all of which would become staples of European diets. I mean, like tomatoes, tobacco, and chocolate is like literally in every meal in Europe at this point. Like it is the staple of their diet, all thanks to the Americas.
Yeah, that's a
And
French
while
repas
Europeans,
right there.
exactly, chocolates and cigarettes. Now, while Europeans, on the other hand, introduced horses, guns, pigs, and sugarcane to the Americas. Pigs would become Cuba's favorite meal, while sugar became Cuba's largest and most valuable resource. And the sugar industry really started to take off in the 18th century. And it's taken for granted today, but back then sugar was mind-blowing. It was like an insane addition that you could have to your pantry. You take bitter products like coffee, chocolate, and tea, you add some sugar, and again, you have the basis of a lot of people's diets today. And demand for it was staggering to the point where Cuba had a hard time keeping up. And some two-thirds of the slaves who were forced to work in the New World didn't do so on cotton plantations, but on sugar plantations. It was sugar that was really driving the demand for slaves in the New World.
Yeah, it's funny reading about like this early time for the Spanish. They were so obsessed with gold, and I know that's like a stereotype, but it cannot be overstated how obsessed these people were with gold.
Sure.
But they didn't realize that the sugar that they found was the gold. It would change everything from here on out, but they were so obsessed with it they didn't quite realize it. But it was very quick that sugar became the cash crop of the region, and gold was awesome to start with, but it moves very quickly into sugar and tobacco, especially.
100%. And by the mid 18th century, there were 50,000 slaves in Cuba. And by the end of the century, there would be another 300,000 brought to the island. And it's also interesting though, because in the 18th century, this is when Spain's power begins to falter, right? They've now had a few centuries of undisputed rule from these colonies, but due to administrative failures, mismanagement, fragile economy, constant war with Britain, including the 7 Years' War, and the rulership of literally inbred rulers. Spain at this point is being run by the Habsburg family, which is such a fascinating family in human history. But they're one of the most successful dynasties in all of history. They start as a small group in Austria. They end up becoming the kings and queens of the Holy Roman Empire, of Hungary, and of Spain. And the Habsburgs ruled Spain for hundreds of years, and they were famous for marrying their uncles to their nieces. And this caused widespread deformities. They became like hideously inbred from this. They're famous for the Habsburg jaw. You see portraits of them. They have a protruding lower jaw from being so inbred. And this would culminate with Charles II of Spain, who was so inbred that had a deformed head. He could barely walk. He could barely speak. And he ends up being just completely defunct. And so this is who was ruling your empire at the time, and just things did not go well.
Yeah, I remember these people think that they're divine by God, and like the guy's head was fucked. It's like,
Dude,
guys,
I just Googled this. Holy shit.
oh, dude, it's
You
wild. I
can
mean,
see it in the portrait.
I think they started in like the 13th century. So it's like, this is hundreds of years of uncles fucking their nieces and becoming jaw mutants. It's wild. And the
It's like-
Habsburgs had so much power that it really did fall apart because of such bad genetics that their leaders just couldn't hold it together. But for a good, a couple hundred years there, Habsburg ran everything. And actually, because I thought it was interesting, the Habsburgs started out of Switzerland. So the goddamn
Yeah.
Swiss have their toes in this madness. So thanks for
Yeah.
that, Switzerland.
I'm looking at this. There's a picture of Lord Farquaad for Habsburg John. I
Not too
wonder
far
if
off, honestly.
that's maybe what he might have been based off of. I don't know, but I think we might need to enter this into our arsenal of insults for people calling them Habsburg.
Oh my God.
You Habsburg
that needs to catch on.
What's up, you Habsburg?
Well, yeah, again, like you have a Habsburg jawed, deformed ruler. Things don't go well. And Spain saw its hold on the New World start to slip away to Britain. And by the 1760s, Spain had actually lost territory to Britain, and Cuba itself was briefly occupied by the UK. Spain, however, could not afford to lose Cuba. So in 1763, Spain made the tough decision to broker a simple deal: Florida in exchange for Cuba. Britain accepted this, and Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain in exchange for the return of Cuba.
Hey, Ikas, really quickly before we get into that, I thought was really interesting the positioning of Havana, which you never really think about, but there's a reason why Cuba was so damn important, and it was the discovery of the Gulf Stream. which goes right in between the strait there, flows right past Havana. So essentially, it sped up the route. So at a certain point, I forget what year it was, but basically the Spanish made it a rule that if you're crossing the Atlantic, you had to go in ships of 10 or more, or 15 or more, or something like that. So basically what ended up happening is everyone would meet in Havana first. And that's where like ships would winter if you still had to wait for like the rest of the armada to come through. So Havana became like the place to be for the shipping world, and is because of the Gulf Stream, which, little American fun fact, was actually named the Gulf Stream by none other than Ben Franklin, who studied it way further north on the outside the coast of Pennsylvania, where the Gulf Stream still goes up. But basically, because of the current that goes through, it sped up shipping lanes so much in that area that Havana became the spot to be. There was kind of a fun story that ship captains that first discovered it were so stupefied by it because they'd be on like a clear day, not a cloud in the sky, and they would lose ships for days at a time because they'd be going so much faster that they'd lose them on the horizon. Which has got to be just a wild like mystery of nature if you're a Spanish conquistador in the 1400s. But I thought that was super cool, and it kind of explains why Havana in particular has been so important throughout all of this.
Fun fact.
Yeah, and again, Spain's power is faltering here. And so to lose Cuba would have been the final nail in the coffin. So that is largely why, again, they decided to broker this deal and give up Florida. And it's very likely that had this exchange not taken place, Cuba would have remained a British territory at the start of the American Revolution. This would have changed things drastically, as we'll get into. And it's one of those seemingly small footnotes of history, like, oh, they exchanged Florida for Cuba. But had that not occurred, like truly, the course of human history would have changed. And again, we're going to get into it, but put a pin on that one for now. Despite its fleeting power, Spain was on the lookout for revenge after losing all these wars to Britain, having to, embarrassingly do this switcheroo. They waited for the right opportunity to strike back at the British Empire, and they found their chance with an unlikely cast of characters, that being the founding fathers of what would become the United States of America.
Yeah, it's eventually, because I would love to do a series on Florida. It's the
really
little
should.
known colony. I mean, some call it the 14th colony. Obviously, we know our 13th from the American Revolution. But had it not been for this sale from Great Britain in exchange for Cuba, like Florida was essentially split from East Florida and West Florida. It is a whole history upon itself. St. Augustine is one of the longest continuously run settlements it is the longest continuously run settlement in the New World, and it was a Spanish settlement for that entire time. But the switch there right before the American Revolution with Spain or with Florida is fascinating. Eventually we'll go into it a little bit. There's a great documentary on PBS that goes through East and West Florida, but the history there, the slave trade there, there were points where they would allow slaves to come from the South down there, and they would have protections, and then the British saw that as like an affront to everything, so that changed. Florida's got a fascinating history, so if anyone out there does want to kind of look into the 14th colony of Florida, it is fascinating.
Truly. And the oldest city in America, St. Augustine, was in Florida. There was a city found, like you were saying, it was a city founded in like 1560s, is still inhabited. Like Florida history does go way back, and it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's
was
cool.
Was the power of this was the power of this trade realized at the time? Was it thought to be so strategic?
I mean, this happened so many times with these powers, like England, Britain, France, and Spain were constantly trading around territories and colonies. It happened all the time. But again, for Spain, it was extremely important on Spain's side because Cuba was its most predominant, wealthy, prosperous colony. And again, Spain domestically in Europe was really struggling financially, and they were completely dependent on that slave labor, on the sugar, on the exporting from Spain, or from Cuba. So really important, but that happened all the time. Like they would switch these Caribbean islands around all the time.
Yeah. The Spanish it's kind of, I don't know, universal karma or something, but they took so much gold out of the New World and shipped it back. It actually sank the Spanish economy. There was so much influx of wealth
just because of the surplus.
It crushed the Spanish economy.
Yeah, they didn't know what to do with it.
And it was
Yeah.
kind of part of the
Wow.
downfall of Spain that we're going to get into, and where you start seeing the English come onto the scene, and it's a little bit of karmic justice.
Truly.
Good.
Now, Cuban and U.S. relations begin in 1776, right at the
Heard of it?
literal start, and the two countries are intertwined forever. In 1776, 13 colonies declared independence, but the revolution had just begun. The fate of the colonies was far from decided, and the situation was actually quite dire. People think, and I think probably far too many Americans think, that we were a fully functioning, up and running country from July 4th, 1776 onward. But really, we were only 2 years into an eventual 8-year war of independence. And the colonies faced a life or death war against the world's largest empire without an organized army, without financing, without a constitution, because that wouldn't come until 1789, and without alliances. So, really, on July 4th, 1776, the United States was a nation really only in name. And in 1777, just a year after declaring independence and after the Liberty Bell was rung in triumph, the British occupied Philadelphia and hung the Union Jack in Independence Hall, in the same room that the founding fathers had declared independence just a year prior. So a
Ugh.
year in, the British are hanging their flag on Independence Hall. So the founding fathers are nervously debating what to do next, and it soon became clear that to defeat Britain, the support of France and Spain was essential to the American Revolution. The colonies just couldn't handle this war on their own. They needed powerful allies, and Spain was one such potential ally. Upon seeing this conflict break out, Spain sent a merchant named Juan de Morales, who was living in Havana at the time. They sent him to gather intelligence on the situation. He was essentially hired as a spy on the colonies to see if the American cause was worth Spain's time. So while Ben Franklin was negotiating alliances with France, the Spanish envoy, Juan Morales, became the main Spanish point of contact for the founding fathers. And Juan de Morales quickly became fully entrenched in the American Revolution. I mean, he almost has like a Forrest Gump like journey through this early part of the history. Like he has a front row seat for some of the most historic moments in U.S. history. He marches with the Continental Congress on the return to Philadelphia in 1778 when they recapture it from the British. He took part in the country's first 4th of July celebration. He befriended all of the founding fathers. He was a close friend of Alexander Hamilton, who, side note, was also born in the Caribbean. And he would become friends with George Washington. He would even have Christmas dinner with George and Martha Washington. And he became business partners with Robert Morris. This was a very powerful business partner to have because Robert Morris is a very important early American figure. He's known as the financier of the American Revolution. There's statues of him all over Philadelphia, including right outside of Independence Hall. And he's a true early American in that he was a early proponent of capitalism. He was a pragmatic businessman, also a slave trader. Let's not forget that he was one of the biggest slave traders in the New World at the time. But Robert Morris understood that war requires money, and he was the one that was finding it for Washington's ragtag army. Morris brokered a crucial relationship with Spain through Juan Morales, and Juan Morales, in his part, would champion the American cause to the King of Spain. And it is because of Juan Morales, in part, that Spain decided to fully commit support to the American rebels and enter into a formal alliance.
Hey, Ikis, really quickly. So when I was reading about Juan de Morales, there's a lot of similarities to the Marquis de Lafayette, George
Yes.
Washington's French envoy. And the Marquis de Lafayette is so much more famous in American history. And I don't really see why, because, reading this, it is obviously the Battle of Yorktown. We kind of credit the French for their help there and with us becoming a country, but the Spanish and Juan de Morales were almost equally as important. I don't know why he's
Agreed.
not as famous.
Agreed. Well, on that point, there's many kind of like standalone Europeans that were true heroes in the American Revolution. And you have like von Steuben, that was a Prussian German general that was also really helped train the Continental Army. I think with Juan de Morales, it's the fact that like Lafayette was on the battlefield, right? Like he was a soldier that was getting shot at. He was shooting. I think the thing with Juan de Morales is that it was much more behind the scenes. It was economics. It was funding. I think that kind of just like it's not as sexy and fun as Lafayette, honestly. So I think he was forgotten about. But to your point, I think he is a forgotten about founding father, like legitimately. I think we'll go on to see how important Spain and Cuba is to the American Revolution. But Juan de Morales is at the center of really helping the American Revolution unfold.
Was he natural born Cuban, or was he from
So
Spain?
he was born in Spain, but when he was a child, he went to Havana and had lived most of his life in Havana. Now, through Robert Morris and Wanda Morales, they spark up this relationship and they open up a line of credit with Spain that Spain was happy to provide as its chance to take revenge on Britain for the 7 Years' War, of having to do this swap. And Morris and Morales opened up a private shipping channel between Havana and Philadelphia. And Cuban silver became the main financial backbone of the revolution. And this was huge because Spanish silver was the world standard currency of the time. Like similar to the USD today, Spain had spent the last 300 years with its empire. Like Spanish silver was the main source of currency. So to get that as your financing was huge, like massive for the revolution. Again, you do not have a revolution or a fighting force without the economics and be able to pay people, move things around. Like you need that money. So that was a huge, huge get.
So we, again, average person looking back on American history, the founding fathers, the time of like us declaring our independence from Britain, we were being funded by trade through Cuba in Spanish silver. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate interpretation of what you're saying here?
Yeah, Spain essentially gave us a line of credit to buy supplies, muskets, cannons, resources, in some cases troops were delivered, and Spain was
Yeah.
financing this, giving us access to these goods. Right, in hopes that, and it was again all on credit, like we're gonna have to pay them back, but they're it's just like how the U.S. does today with proxy wars. Like we fund rebel groups all the time. We just talked about the Iran Contra affair in our
Yeah.
last series, right? We're like funding these rebel movements. It's funny to like have the roles reversed, but at this point, the U.S. is just another rebellion across the world. That Spain was like, here's an opportunity for us to maybe hurt Britain. We're gonna fund them, so they gave them silver, guns, troops, cannons. To the point where Cuba was America's first trade partner, and in many ways, Cuba was the United States' first friend. I mean, in the early days of the war, the Continental Army was almost entirely outfitted by Cuban armories, so it was goods and supplies from Cuba that really launched off
Yeah, that's crazy.
the first fighting force.
Hey, Rhett, really
I
quick,
just thought it was so much more.
Go ahead.
I just thought it was just so much more grassroots, from us, like people coming over here, like somehow fighting this battle that we need to fight to declare our independence. So that's just fascinating to me to learn that it was not this like grassroots movement that I maybe
It
thought
was
it
that.
was.
It definitely was all of that, but it's that's not the whole story. Like it definitely,
Yeah.
you needed the buy-in from a large part of the population. Like there was tremendous, like the Join or Die campaign, right? Like one of the most famous propaganda campaigns that Ben Franklin had. Like it was entirely grassroots, but to go against a world empire, like you need help, you need friends, and we'll see this because this becomes a problem for Cuba later on. They can't get these alliances, so we shouldn't downplay what these alliances meant.
Yeah, I think this part's a little bit weird for Americans to kind of wrap our head around because we do think the American Revolution was like the most important thing going on at that time. But if you kind of take a step back, I listened to a great series. I hate to plug another history podcast here, but The Rest is History with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, great British historians.
Yeah, great podcast.
Perspective of the U.S. Revolution was very different than what we learned, and a lot of it was the U.S. was not the most important thing to England. Honestly, the Jamaica and their Caribbean assets were way more important for the trade. But at the time, England was fighting France. They were fighting the Spanish. They were fighting over in Asia with India. They were fighting literally all over the world. So for the British, it was not the end all be all for them, where the American Revolution was for us, but they were fighting so many different countries that the French and Spanish, they used us as, like you said, it's a good example. It's basically a proxy war of the 1700s. They just used us for their gains, and we used them for our gains. But in the global strategic battle that was going on at the time, it was basically everyone versus England, because this is where you get the English Empire. They were a little slow to start in the New World, but pretty much from this point onwards, I don't know, until World War II, I guess, is where you start to see the downfall of the British Navy. But this is where you start seeing England. And it was just everyone ganging up against them, and we were just a piece of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, is it fair to say, or I'm curious your guys' opinion on this, like, was there an America there an American Revolution, and was there the independence we have today without the backing that we got and without being
Absolutely
supported
not.
through the ways that we did?
No,
Yeah.
no, just uncategorically no. Like it would not have succeeded without the help of France and Spain. And again, we're going to see what happens when you don't get these alliances from bigger powers when you're a small fledgling state that wants independence. It doesn't work out. Like, and this happens in Cuba's history that we're going to get into. But those alliances were massive. I mean, it immediately legitimized us. They recognized the government. They were giving us money. They were giving us war funds. Like it was huge. There simply is no United States without France and Spain.
Yeah. Interesting.
Now, while wintering with General Washington in New Jersey in the thick of the war in 1780, Juan de Morales would fall ill and die. Although he didn't see the fruits of his labor, Cuba continued to provide essential assistance in the final phases of the revolution. And even the final climactic battle of the revolution, the Battle of Yorktown, it was completely financed with Cuban funds, like right in the nick of time. Like they had the British army trapped. It was like a Dunkirk situation. They didn't have supplies or anything to get there, and Cuban silver, right in the nick of time, came there so that they could get these supplies, cannons, and troops to be able to win the war.
But Ikas, why do we not get told that? Is it because
Yeah.
we've whitewashed Cuban history? Like, that doesn't make
It's
any sense to me.
because
You hear Battle of Yorktown, you think of the French. Everyone thinks of the
well,
French.
it's realizing how indoctrinated and propagandized U.S. education is, where it's about becoming a staunch, happy patriot, where the U.S. is number one. So anything that goes against that narrative gets swept under the rug in this case, because you're right, like it's never talked about. And we're getting like again, I'm gonna mention it later, but hundreds of French soldiers and Spanish soldiers died. There are foreign soldiers that would give their lives in the American Revolution. Again, we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's because it goes against the narrative that like you said, Rhett, like it's a grassroots. Americans picked up pitchforks and farmers were firing muskets, and we
I
won the
saw
war.
Mel
And it's
Gibson. I know how it works.
Yeah, dude.
Heath Ledger and Mel Gibson got the job done, and we don't need to talk about anything else.
I mean, do you think any of that's tied to? All right, let me preface this by saying, like, the history that we know today of the revolution and us gaining our independence, like, did the story always exclude Cuba and what was going on here, or was that something that, like, we changed up the history of this because of this, communism state and all the things that were to come later? Is that the reason why we don't want to be associated with this being like a strategic trading partner during this time?
Yeah, that's my theory on it, Ikas.
Yeah, no, for sure. And like soon we're going to talk about how prominent Cuba is in American politics and how much it's talked about by presidents. So I think for sure, everything changes over the last 70 years to where we are today with communism and how we downplay it, and also just the overall sentiment that against Hispanic Americans and brown people in North and South America. I think it always gets underplayed because it's not white people as the hero. And so that definitely is a factor. Now, again, Juan de Morales unfortunately dies, but the network that he created continues to flourish. And again, there is no US without a Spanish Cuba and without the networks made possible by Juan de Morales. He is a crucial and all too forgotten about player in American Revolution. And if you don't believe me, you can take it from George Washington, who right after Juan died, he said, "I have been happy in ranking him among the number of mine. In this country, he has been universally esteemed and his death universally regretted." And Morales was essentially given a state funeral. Robert Morris and George Washington were the chief mourners, and most of the newly formed Continental Congress was in attendance. So
That's amazing.
it is amazing. Now, with the help of Spain and France, after 8 long years, in 1783, the American Revolution was over. Spain found itself in a kind of a strange situation because they had just backed the first successful pro-democratic liberation movement in the Americas. And again, Spain at this point is a very staunch monarchy, and they now found themselves at the center of liberation in the New World. And in more ways than one, the new republic that Spain fought to create became a source of grief and fear for Spain. Once the dust settled, Spain realized maybe we just unleashed a new regional power that's going to threaten our own hegemony. Despite these fears, the two countries were essentially keeping each other running. American farms were feeding Cuba, Cuban silver was continuing to back the financial systems of the new republic, not to mention all the sugar and tobacco that America was buying from Cuba at the time. Then, in 1789, the Spanish government opened up the Cuban slave trade to foreign investors. This allowed anyone of any nation to sell slaves in Spanish ports. And the new American Republic heard this news, and almost immediately, American slave traders arrived in Havana ready to sell and profit from human beings.
Yeah, this is
Now,
going to get into maybe another reason why we don't talk about American history with Cuba very much. It gets a little rough here for the old red, white, and blue.
Yeah,
yeah.
we just want to swipe that shit under the rug,
Yeah.
right? Act like that's something that we didn't do and weren't heavily involved in and didn't build our country. So
Oh
awesome.
boy, does it get bad too. Cameron's not lying.
Yeah.
By the 1800s, Cuba is a true melting pot. It's a multicultural nation with most islanders being of mixed descent of Spanish, African, and Taino heritage. At the top of the food chain was a small group of predominantly white Spaniards. Slavery and the sins of racial discrimination would become a massive problem for the rest of Cuba's history. It's very similar to the United States, in which systemic racism has become an issue that Cuba just has never really been able to solve. By the 1820s, another 300,000 slaves embarked for Cuba, and the black population surpassed the white population on the island for the first time. This came at the same time as a boom in the sugar industry, another massive boom, and Havana was at the center of a sugar revolution. Production intensified, and the need for slave labor grew with it. Cuba's economic system was based overwhelmingly on this one export of a single crop, that being sugar, and it was all being run on large plantations worked by African slaves. Sugar was king, and by the 1830s, the island of Cuba was producing more of it than any other place on earth. The working conditions on these sugar mills are horrific. If you want to get into the detail, like they're truly some of the worst things I have ever read in my life. So, trigger warning. But the conditions on these were truly abhorrent. You have extreme heat, the sickening smell of these giant boiling vats of raw sugar. It's just relentless work. It was a real hellscape, and it was made even worse by the fact that the refining process of sugar is extremely time sensitive, meaning that slaves were worked constantly without breaks from sunrise to sunset. At most, they were getting 4 hours of sleep every day. Now, this abuse did not go unchecked. Inspired by the American, French, and the Haitian revolutions, the entire Americas exploded with their own revolutionary movement. The plight for freedom found its way to Cuba. There was black-led revolutions that sprung up all over the island, but these uprisings failed because, as we've been saying, to face the full brunt of a colonial power is a daunting task. And as the US Revolution just showed, you need the backing of other powerful nations. And these Cuban liberty fighters, especially black Cubans, weren't able to find any sort of alliance from Britain, France, or the US. Just no one was willing to back a black led revolution. And that has a lot to do with the Haitian Revolution, which, Cameron, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, we definitely want to touch or put a little spotlight on the Haitian Revolution here. Red, it's one of the only, if not the only, successful slave revolt in history. Essentially, an uprising on the island caused the government of England at the time to basically declare citizenship for their people in 1791. And the island of Haiti to this day still remains free. Granted, you could make an argument that this slave uprising has literally led to how Haiti is treated by Western powers today. And although it was like an incredibly inspiring revolution of breaking the shackles of slavery and stuff. Basically, the story and how it was used turned very dark, and the Spanish used it for their aim. So, Ikis, you want to kind of enlighten on that one?
Yeah, well, the slaves of Haiti revolted, and they ended up killing 200 white settlers on Haiti and started their own nation. And this terrified the rest of the colonial powers because it was in a watershed moment of racism in world history. This was their worst fear: it was black people killing white people and starting their own nation. And again, unfortunate to say the least timing for these Cuban black-led revolutions, because it came right at the tail end of the Haitian Revolution, where any sort of backing of black rebels was seen as abhorrent and like not going to happen. Now, while Cuba faced threats internally from liberation movements, they also faced threats externally as well. Situated at the gateway of the Gulf of Mexico, as Cameron was saying, with the Gulf Stream, considered the key to the New World, geography was destiny for Cuba, and this meant that the island faced an imminent invasion from several nations. Britain had their sights on Cuba, Mexico was considering an invasion of their own, and now the young country of the US started to think about what its policy should be when it comes to Cuba. For many US statesmen, the ideal form of the new republic included Cuba. Thomas Jefferson in 1809 said, "I would immediately erect a column on the southernmost limit of Cuba, and we should then have such an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since creation." John Quincy Adams even wrote, "The annexation of Cuba to our federal republic will be indispensable to the continuance and integrity of the Union itself," which is pretty amazing. This is a president saying that the country will not survive without Cuba as a part of it. Thomas Jefferson always prophesized an American empire that encompassed an American Cuba. And by this point in 1821, the U.S. had also acquired Florida and huge tracts of land in the West from the Louisiana Purchase a few decades earlier, and a massive amount of trade goods flowed from New Orleans to the rest of the world. And this put American businessmen on notice, because now that we had New Orleans, we were shipping tons and tons and tons of cotton to Europe. It was a massive part of the Southern economy. And a lot of these Southern businessmen felt that Cuba had the potential to cripple American commerce, right? A Cuban government could deny safe passage from that Gulf Stream to thousands of ships leaving New Orleans, almost like Strait of Hormuz style. They could shut off this strait if they wanted. For Adams and Jefferson, right, backed by this, fear of a Cuban government going against American interests, the question was not whether, but when Cuba would become a part of the U.S. And honestly, in my opinion, if you went back in time and told Thomas Jefferson that Hawaii is a state and Cuba is not, he would probably laugh in your face and he wouldn't believe you. Just to show you how confident people were back then that Cuba would be a state.
It's crazy.
What's interesting is that the wealthy elite in Cuba also wanted to become American. Evil underlying reason of this U.S.-Cuba merger was the institution of slavery. The wealthiest Cubans were slaveholders, and these elites were so racist that they believed that domination by the Spanish crown or an American president was better than a free Cuba with freed slaves and racial equality. They ultimately worried that Cuban independence would lead to the abolition of slavery, and many American investors feared this as well, because at this point you have an entire economy in the South that's getting based off of slaves in Cuba. The American Southern slave ecosystem was entirely dependent on the new slaves that were being brought in from Cuba. But in 1807, the U.S. banned the international slave trade, penalizing anyone who engaged in it but liberating none of the captives. Despite the ban, it was largely ignored. Slavery remained a booming industry, and many wealthy U.S. slaveholders saw Cuba as prime territory. They saw a floating slave metropolis, and the ultimate dream of these slaveholders was that they could turn Cuba into 3 slaveholding states. John C. Calhoun, who would become one of the Confederacy's most outspoken pro-slavery advocates, lobbied hard for President Monroe to annex Cuba. And Monroe considered it very closely, but he eventually got cold feet, because in 1821, the U.S. is still a young country. The prospect of any sort of overseas invasion just wasn't in the cards. But Monroe didn't want to give up entirely. The U.S. saw Cuba as a ticking time bomb. Eventually, Spain would lose its hold on Cuba, and it was only inevitable that at some point Cuba would be free, and that would put a massive target on Cuba's back, a target that the U.S. wanted to ensure only they could hit. So in 1823, President Monroe it's bizarre. It is a bizarre piece of policy in place, and something that would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. In it, the U.S. declared that the Western Hemisphere was henceforth closed off to European colonization. It preserved Cuba for an American future and safeguarded an already emerging system that wrapped the U.S. economy in slavery. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine put a pin in Cuba to preserve it so the U.S. could annex it when the time was right. And it made sure that any other European power like Britain or France couldn't take over Cuba and then ban slavery. So in large part, it was to preserve slavery in Cuba.
Yeah. Go ahead, Red.
No, you okay.
We got a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, man. I guess my first question in this is, would you guys say the Monroe Doctrine is kind of the beginning of America acting like an empire and starting to want to conquer areas? Is that fair?
Yes.
That propelled all this?
I mean, the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny are kind of the same thing. At this point, where the Americans are is that we believed everything on that continent is our God-given right. So at this point, Americans were traveling west from kind of the colonies that we've established and keep pushing further and further. And these lands were given to the native populations, and what happened is just settlers didn't give a fuck. They just came through the areas, they took whatever they could, and it just kept pushing more and more west. what that results in is this kind of superiority complex of this is all of ours. And the Monroe Doctrine is just a continuation of that. It's basically, all right, we've set up everything and now you guys can all fuck off. Stay away from our area, stay away from this part of the world. And it was viewed a little bit as like defensive. It's, hey, don't mess with us. We won't mess with you. This is our side of the globe. But in practicality, what it did is saying, okay, we're one part of 35 countries on this side of the Western Hemisphere, and all the Monroe Doctrine said is we control it. It didn't basically give any rights to the countries around here. It didn't give any protections to Cuba from the United States' powers. It just basically told the European powers that it's ours. For our more kind of astute listeners right now, you might have heard of the Donroe Doctrine from the current administration, and that's literally a direct play, obviously, off of the Monroe Doctrine, and it's the same idea. We use this for our justification to be able to take anything in the Western Hemisphere. So we first kind of saw the Monroe Doctrine pop up again when the Greenland talks were going on, and then when we took out the leader of Venezuela, we heard about it again, and it's all kind of under this weird early 1800s America where we just believed everything was all right. We became the Spanish.
Yeah. Well, and like drawing the comparison today, hearing these things today and what you just went through as far as these new modern time reasons we're bringing it up, my mind was attached to that in the future too, that it was just for like strategic control and land. But what I'm hearing is this is more in preservation of slavery and slave economies than anything else. I mean, that's like a major unlearning part for me here. Seems to not be for anything else besides that.
Yeah, I mean that again. There's no mysteries except the new history. Because before reading into this, I wouldn't have brought slavery into the equation at all with the Monroe Doctrine. But it is key to it. I mean, it was to keep a slave-holding Cuba ready for when the U.S. was in the right place to invade. It's a really interesting question, though, of like when did American imperialism start? And this, I don't know if they meant it to be that, but it is like disgustingly imperialist policy where it's like we're just going to hold this region off until we have the army ready to go take it over. And I don't think the US becomes as expansionist without Cuba. I really don't. It was always kind of like a dangling carrot and stick. And then, as we'll see later in this century, it does go into full-on imperialist expansion. But yeah, it's a really interesting question on when that originates, and I think it probably does start with the Monroe Doctrine. Now, slavery again continues, and in the 1820s, Spain decided to outlaw slave trading as well. And this again did nothing to stop it. It was kind of like Prohibition, where it just created an organized crime syndicate that kept the business running. And in fact, all the Africans forcibly transported to Cuba over the 300 years of slavery, more than 70% arrived after Spain legalized the trade in the 1820s.
That's crazy.
American businessmen were deeply implicated in this illegal slave trade, and a big reason for that. American ships, insured by New York companies, sailed to West Africa where they purchased slaves and then sold them in Havana at huge profits. Again, while the slave trade is illegal in both the US and Spain. The U.S. consul in Havana not only knew this was happening, but he was, of course, helping to run it. And America opened up its sort of its own fucked up boutique slave trade in Cuba that was led by the sitting U.S. Senator James DeWolf. So this is going at the top of both Spanish-Cuban government and U.S. government.
Wait,
now, slave trading.
hold
Go
on.
ahead.
We both, the U.S. and Spain, had declared slavery trade illegal, correct?
The trade illegal, not the practice.
The trade.
Yes.
Okay.
So in like 1830,
okay.
England even did it, but the U.S. There's a reason we held on to 1861. Before
it became illegal to buy slaves or to get slaves from Africa and then bring them to the New World and sell it. You could keep the slaves that you have are still slaves. You can trade internally, but you can't go externally to get new slaves. So what these U.S. businessmen were doing.
Cuba was a loophole.
Cuba was a loophole, 100%.
Yeah.
And it was used as such. It was used as literally an offshore place to continue the slave trade, where again they're going to West Africa and stealing people and then selling them in Havana at massive profits. And a lot of those buyers, and they were going all over, right? Like it literally became it's fucked up because these are human beings. It's a terrible comparison, but like drugs, where like you're sourcing drugs and you're selling it. Whoever wants to buy it can come and buy it, even though it's illegal. It's working the same way, and that's why again I equate it to prohibition, because it became an organized crime syndicate of selling human beings.
Crazy.
Slaves weren't the only business venture of Americans, and Americans started showing up in droves, buying, operating, and investing across the island. The city of Matanzas in Cuba eventually had so many American owned and operated plantations that it was called the American City amongst locals. Cuba's sugar mills and its illegal slave trade became an essential part of the history of American capitalism. The US used these profits to reinvest in financial firms and banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing back home. There was illegal slave trading funds from Cuba that helped finance the US expansion westward, and the American network of slave labor from Charleston to New York was all linked to Cuba. So the massive slave economy that would lead to the Civil War was being sourced in large part from these slaves from Cuba. Now, ostensibly, the U.S. began to operate in Cuba, at least economically, as if it already was a U.S. territory, even though it was still technically a Spanish territory. And I want to make the point that we should see Cuba Americans should see Cuba as a bordering country. Like, and I get that there's a 90-mile stretch of ocean between Cuba and Florida, but it really is. We should view it as a neighbor, like Canada or Mexico, because the amount of people and money and culture and art and weapons and the amount of trade and just exchange between these two countries really does make Cuba a functioning bordering country. And this is when this really starts to play out in this time period. And it got so convoluted that in 1853, Franklin Pierce and his pick for vice president, William Rufus King, were running for office. They were trying to get into the White House, and they were running on a pro-slavery expansionist platform. So I think it's, again, to answer your question, right? Like after the Monroe Doctrine, we now have people running for the White House on expansionist platforms. And they even had sort of like a Make Cuba American ticket as part of their platform. That was a big part of their policies, that they would finally bring in Cuba to become a state.
They were saying after he was elected, or during his rallies, there, one of the mottos that would be "For Pierce, for Cuba," like at the same time.
Yeah.
Very like interconnected. It was very interesting to read.
It's fascinating.
I mean, running on that had to have meant that a lot of average Americans wanted this to happen, right?
destiny.
I mean,
Yeah.
to campaign
well,
on that.
It's more of a classic American story of really wealthy people in a niche industry lobbying hard for this to happen.
Yeah.
Gonna get into that. We're gonna get into that.
Okay.
Because with Pierce gunning for the White House, seemed like the time was almost right. Let's remove the pin from the Monroe Doctrine and go in for Cuba. Now, it's a little bit of a side tangent here, but it is relevant because Franklin Pierce's pick for VP, William King, he was a really wealthy cotton planter, pro-slavery advocate, with tons of ties to the Cuban slave trade and a lot of connections to Cuba. Because again, Cuba is kind of the beating heart of the American slave system. Now, on the campaign trail, he got tuberculosis and he started to slowly die. And so his doctor, like so many of the time, was just like, just go south, hit a beach, let the warm weather cure your disease. Like that'll take care of it. So he listened. He went to Cuba because again, he had a lot of connections there. And this was during an active presidential campaign, though. It's crazy. So like the running VP is slowly dying of tuberculosis, and he decides to go to a sugar mill in Cuba. And while there, they win the election.
Crazy.
He's in Cuba when they win, but he was too weak to travel back to the States, and so King was sworn in as vice president of the U.S. while in Cuba. This is the first and only time this has happened. 2 weeks later, at death's door, he traveled back to Alabama so that he could die in his home state, which he did the next day.
Yeah, the old racist
Pierce would
bitch
soldier
died
on.
one day. Like, he got home and died
Right.
one day later. Suck on that, fucking loser.
But it's amazing. Again, like there's a vice president is inside Cuba, and it just goes to show the ties of the two countries. Like despite it still being a Spanish territory, despite it, the Monroe Doctrine still being in place, there's leaders, American leaders are there getting sworn in because of the connections. Now, President Pierce would soldier on. He would become president, and it was his presidency where the first sustained attempt by the U.S. to acquire Cuba would happen. And it became a very real piece of policy backed by powerful Southern Democrats, to answer your question, Rhett, all of whom were wealthy slaveholders. No, there was even a secret plan drafted by Secretary of State William L. Marcy. This was known as the Ostend Manifesto. This plan said that if Spain refused to sell Cuba, the U.S. should have congressional authority to invade Cuba as a matter of national security, which is literally almost verbatim what the current Secretary of State Marco Rubio is saying about Cuba right now, that we need to
Interesting.
go in there as a matter of national security. Very interesting.
Yeah, holy shit.
Now, this secret plan came at the worst possible time because it was right at about the same time as the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Bleeding Kansas. So, despite still being a decade away from the start of the Civil War, Americans were already killing each other over the question of slavery in the 1850s. This is what is known as Bleeding Kansas. But I know, Cameron, this is something you're very passionate about.
One of my favorite chapters of U.S. history, and not for like great reasons, but it's just fascinating to me. So to kind of paint the picture of where we were as a country at this point, anytime the United States was adding a territory to the state, basically the argument was, is it going to be free or is it going to be a slave state? And essentially to get around that, for every state that we added another one that was either pro-slavery or anti-slavery, depending on which was the first one. Bleeding Kansas is a fascinating example of sort of the passions that were going on at the time. John Brown, who I will take every freaking opportunity to bring up on this podcast, my favorite U.S. history or U.S. character. He was a bit of a deadbeat lawyer, but he was so anti-slavery that him and his sons would actually went to Kansas, which was a pro or anti-slavery state. But the settlers from Missouri, known as the Missouri Tigers, which you might ring a bell if you're a college football fan or college basketball fan, they still use that name, which is crazy. But the Missouri Tigers basically would go across the border to Kansas, killing people, trying to take the state to be pro-slavery. John Brown said no and basically would fight them off one by one. John Brown would eventually go on to Harper's Ferry, trying to start a slave revolt, and essentially kicked off the Civil War and a few other pieces there. But this is just where the U.S. was at this time. We were fighting in the West everywhere you could, but Bleeding Kansas was definitely the most popular.
Right. So when the secret plan eventually gets leaked to the press somehow, and it rightfully pissed a lot of people off because just as the nation is debating hotly and killing each other over who should become a slave state and who shouldn't, the top of the government has a plan to make Cuba 3 slave states, which would have drastically changed the balance of power. It was a complete hypocritical move. It was a slap in the face of the national debate. And the Pierce administration was rightfully clowned for this leak. Again, it was hypocrisy. It just went into the face of everything that the nation was debating, and he suffered a significant setback. And the manifesto became a rallying cry for anti-slavery Northerners, and this understandably forced Pierce to back off of annexing Cuba. However, this didn't stop people from trying. By the 1850s, the sugar slavery industrial complex, which is really what it should be known as, that linked Cuba and the U.S. Truly. But this linked Cuba, and this link had fully matured between Cuba and the U.S. at this point. 90% of the slave ships that landed in Cuba were built in the U.S. They had American financing, American papers, and American flags to protect them. The trade was illegal, of course, but profitable, which is all that matters to these slaveholding demons. And the U.S. had also just defeated Mexico in the Mexican-American War and annexed Texas. So everyone thought that Cuba was next, right? We got Texas.
Yeah.
We're scooping up these former Spanish colonies. Cuba's next. And it made sense. Cuba was already fully plugged into the U.S. economy. It was a growing slave economy. It seemed like the natural next step. This led to some U.S. Southerners opting to take matters into their own hands. You have the whole embarrassment of that Ostend Manifesto. Spain refuses to sell Cuba. So these U.S. Southerners were going to take matters into their own hands. Southern politicians started conspiring with Cuban rebels who wanted to free Cuba but preserve slavery. That was a big part of the deal. We're like, we can help make Cuba free, but you got to keep slavery.
Free with an asterisk, right?
Free but slavery. Now, the Americans at the head of this conspiracy is insane because it's like a who's who of the future Confederacy. You have the aforementioned John C. Calhoun, who's a champion of bullshit states' rights and slavery. You have a former Vice President, John Quitman, Virginian Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson fucking Davis, who was the eventual future president of the CSA. Their plan was to enlist seasoned soldiers from the Mexican-American War, put together an invading force, send them off to Cuba, and take it over for America. The war goal was to finally turn Cuba into multiple slave states. I mean, this is like insane history that I had never heard of before. Um, but the first attempt at this failed because U.S. agents caught them as they were about to set sail, and they're like, "What the hell are you doing? You can't just
Hold
launch an invasion."
This is just like a private grassroots like secretive we're gonna privately invade Cuba thing going on amongst these
Yeah,
guys.
I mean, Robert E. Lee is the governor of Virginia, and Jefferson Davis was like South Carolina. So these are governors that are forming their own
Yeah.
private armies and then and sending them off to Cuba.
Right. This is the first of at least 3 plots that are exactly like that in Cuba that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
big time.
Yeah,
this is honestly kind of like a proto Bay of Pigs, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like making that connection, but it is.
So they got caught by who trying to do this on the first time, and like how did that get shut down?
U.S. agents you see hundreds of soldiers climbing into a boat with guns, and like what the hell is going on here? So the plan fizzled out there, but they tried again. And the second attempt set sail in 1850, and this was national news at the time, to the point where a New York newspaper flew a newly designed Cuban flag from atop its headquarters, showing their belief that the invasion would succeed. And again, in a weird, bizarre, intermixed moment of history, this was the first time a Cuban flag was flown, and it flew over New York, and it was designed, or the design that it had is the current design of the Cuban flag today, which I think is crazy. Like, it goes back to this random invasion.
And think about that. This flag was made as like basically a symbol of we're about to take Cuba. Like this was using American star, using American stripes on the flag. This was all purposefully done as, hey, they're about to be the Americans. It just blows my mind they still use that flag today.
I know.
And this is such a random question, but slightly related here. Do you guys have any context onto why the Cuban flag and the Puerto Rican flag are the same, just inverse?
No.
No, but I'm
Okay.
sure. I mean, Puerto Rico's obviously
I didn't
a
know.
part of the U.S., so maybe there's some dark. We made their flag too and did the same thing. I don't know, but that's a good question.
Yeah. I didn't know if there was any like relation that you guys knew there.
We'll look into that for next episode, because I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah,
like
put a pin
there's
in that.
something there. Because to Cameron's point, there was a single star on that flag to represent this is going to be the next star on the U.S. flag. Like, Cuba is about to become a state. Now, the second expedition would successfully land on Cuba, but they were immediately driven back into the ocean by Spanish soldiers. And again, like, just so we're clear, this is a pro-slavery invasion of Cuba backed by Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis using American war vets, and they're fighting the Spanish military. It's insane.
And the
It's like
Confederates lose again.
It's like, I feel like you just explained the origin of the Proud Boys.
Hell, he did.
They wish they had an origin that cool. It's much sadder.
Oh man.
Now, in 1851, they try for a third time. This time they had 400 troops, and this new unit would be led by the nephew of the sitting Attorney General, William Crittenden. They would land in Cuba again, and they would be beaten by Spanish soldiers again, but this time they were all either killed or captured. 50 Americans are killed in total, including the nephew of the Attorney General, Crittenden. It's a massive disaster.
What a shit
And this
show.
caused, it's insane. This is their third invasion. And this caused an outcry in the southern U.S. People started calling for full-scale invasion. They adopted a new sort of Remember the Alamo. They started calling it the Massacre of Havana. I know, this is insane.
We're branding pro-slavery invasion of Cuba as the Havana
Oh, yeah.
Massacre.
I mean, this is just southern white Democrat MO here. Now, it almost happened too. Like, there was a big cry for a full-scale invasion, and it damn near happened, because America built its empire on slavery, not just domestically, but on the slavery in Cuba as well. And the U.S. was this close, I mean, really this close to invading Cuba in order to preserve slavery on the island, until the U.S. Civil War breaks out, just to throw a wrench in everything.
Thank God.
Now, once full-scale civil war broke out in the U.S., obviously the U.S. had bigger fish to fry. But even before that, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the end of the Missouri Compromise, like, the timing was now made impossible to annex Cuba. And we're not going to get into the specifics of the Civil War here, obviously, but it should be known that the Confederate States of America and the Civil War, it was all about preserving slavery, and not just in America, but also in Cuba. I mean, again, think back to all the economic ties and the vast illegal slave trade that had existed between the American South and Cuba. All of those American-owned plantations in Cuba depended on the success of the Confederacy, so they were heavily invested. And the reality is that the U.S. Civil War was fought over the future of slavery inside and out of the U.S., which I find fascinating because it wasn't just the U.S. slaves, on the table and at stake. It was all the slaves in Cuba as well.
This is just
Do
a
you
friendly reminder that if anyone tells you that the Civil War was not fought over slavery, is lying to your face.
Yeah, stop
Yeah.
talking to them immediately.
Yes.
point them to this podcast?
Yeah.
Do you think had the Civil War had happened at a later time, would Cuba had been taken and been part of America?
I think it's hard to say. Like, it really was just such a perfect storm where I don't know. It's actually a really hard question to answer because I think again, well, going back to that exchange of Florida and Cuba that Britain and Spain did in 1760s. If at this point Cuba is a state, South probably has a really good chance of winning the Civil War, if not making it last much longer. Because again, they would have turned Cuba into 3 different slave states. You would have had all of the logistical networks, all of the trading, the silver, everything that comes with Cuba would have been a southern state. Would have changed everything. Really would have changed everything. So I don't know. It's hard. But what are your thoughts on that, Cameron?
Yeah, that's tricky. And it's funny that I'm seeing the parallels. The U.S. Civil War breaking out was maybe stopped our invasion of Cuba. It also helped the Mormons take Utah, which is another kind of fun little one. If it wasn't for the Civil War breaking out, we had an army in
Wow.
Wyoming ready to take out the Mormons. But so kind of the same thing happened there, which is just kind of funny. You know, the U.S. Civil War was so monumental. We were such a fractured country before that. I mean, with our expansion, everyone had different goals. So anti-slavery versus like die-hard slavery. This country was so fucked up and so disjointed that I I can't imagine we would have like put it together without the Civil War. I don't think this country would have come together, and almost didn't. I mean, Jim Crow did its damn best to try to fracture us again afterwards, but I think just the state of the country, the Civil War was an inevitability. It was going to happen, whether it be in 1690 or 1861 or 1890. It was just a matter.
Totally. Understand that like it was going to happen eventually, but should it have happened later, do you think Cuba would be part of the U.S.?
If
Do you think
the
they would have
Confederates would
taken
have
it?
gotten Cuba, like he just said, it would have been a very different story. So yeah, that's another kind of history brain twist of who knows what this world would look like had it been a few years later. Had we taken Cuba
Yeah,
10 years before bleeding Kansas? Like, who knows?
yeah. Or like if Monroe didn't do his doctrine and he was just like, all right, fine, let's move in, send troops, and we take over Cuba. Again, it would have become a massive slave state. And it just, a big reason why the Confederacy lost was because of the Union blockade along all the ports. And so if they have Cuba, like you have access to trade anywhere. Like it really would have changed everything. Not for the best. Now, the U.S. Civil War would also see 70 or so Cubans who fought directly in the U.S. Civil War and on both sides. Havana was even used as a wartime port, and there was 100 Confederate ships that docked and used Havana as a base of operations to circumvent the Union blockade. So again, Cuba is pro-slavery. The elite there are wealthy slave owners, so they were actively trying to help the Confederacy here. However, in 1863, Lincoln freed all slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, and in 1865, the Civil War ends with a Union victory. Fortunately, soon after, Lincoln is assassinated. To show the links of these two countries, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Lincoln's assassination was openly and publicly mourned in the streets of Havana. And again, you have to remember that most of Cuba is black and mixed race at this point, and they're still an enslaved populace. So seeing their literal brethren, their family, you know, people that they share a connection and a history with freed in America was a monumental achievement to them. It meant a lot to see freedom, free black people in their part of the world meant a lot. And Abe Lincoln was revered by everyone except the white slaveholders. And similar to the fleeing Nazis in Argentina, many Confederates and slaveholding families fled to Cuba after the war from the South and tried to recreate this slave society of the southern U.S. Now, any notion of Cuban statehood in the U.S. fizzled out after the Civil War because remember, Southern slaveholders, they want to annex Cuba to make it a slave state, but once they lost, any attempt to make Cuba American would mean the freedom of all slaves in accordance with the Emancipation Proclamation. These evil demons, right? Like the literal thought was, if we can't enslave the population, then what's the point of taking it?
Jesus Christ.
Now,
Fucked up.
another civil war would break out, but this time in Cuba, because seeing freedom of slaves in America, Cuban slaves sought to gain freedom of their own. By 1868, the first true Cuban War of Independence occurred, and this is known as the 10 Years' War. And it started actually very similar to a John Brown type of moment when a plantation owner freed his own slaves and then invited them to take up arms and join him in liberating the island from Spanish rule. This war would rage for 10 long years. It was a brutal, brutal, bloody war. It eventually failed, quickly led to another independence war. This time, Spain resorted to propaganda to help crush the rebellion via the use of race as a tactic. This is kind of what we were getting to with the Haitian Revolution. People were afraid that there would be some sort of black uprising where white people would get killed, and Spain used this fear to help quell the rebellion. The black and mixed race rebels couldn't get the much needed support of the wealthy white Cubans because the Spanish crown launched this campaign basically saying that this was a race war in disguise. This isn't about freedom, this isn't about liberty or democracy. This is really about how black people want to kill white people. Now, this is of course a disgusting, blatant racist lie, but it worked. And the war known as the Little War failed because of this movement. They
Isn't
just
that
couldn't
Charles
get
Manson?
the important
Wasn't that
backing.
his same rationale with Helter Skelter?
Yeah, he did think there was going to be a race war.
Behind
Now,
Helter Skelter.
Yeah, I don't know how that. We tied in
Yep,
Manson
you had a Helter
to
Skelter
Spain,
on your
baby.
bingo card. You won.
I love it.
Now, all was for naught. Slavery in Cuba was eventually abolished in 1886 following decades of gradual emancipation, social, political, economic pressures, and off the back of this, 12-year-long war that almost broke the nation, but eventually slavery was abolished. And this was an island that had endured the worst of slavery for 400 years. Cuba's slaves were free, but they still faced systemic racism, constant discrimination, and this will be a through line and a common theme throughout the next of the Cuban history that we get into.
With slavery being abolished there, what did that leave Spain like still having interest in the island and wanting to be there? Like what's the benefit now? Like you said on the American side of it, if we can't have slavery there, there's no benefit of having this island. Like what's the benefit to Spain to continue to have this as a colony?
Well, Spain at this point had lost pretty much everything. Mexico's independent, all of South America had had their independence movements, and this was Spain's first colony. So it had just calcified over the hundreds of years. It had just been completely, I mean, you're talking 400 years of it being a Spanish territory. That's double the age of what the US is now. So we're talking about like a massive amount of history. It was fully Spanish, and I think it was just a lot of legacy beliefs and systems, and it was plugged into Spain, and it just wasn't going to be that easy to have it break off. So it was kind of there just as a matter of time.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in the story, Rhett, we're in the death throes of the Spanish Empire. This is the dwindling of their power over that good part of the century or good part of the millennia is starting to fall apart, and that's going to culminate really at the Spanish-American War, which will be a big part of our next episode.
Now we're going to end things with maybe the most important person in the history of Cuba, certainly for the next few hundred years. He's a really central figure to this entire story, and that is José Martí. And no figure is more central to understanding Cuba than José Martí. He's one of the 19th century's most provocative writers. He helped define what freedom really meant in the Americas, and again, he's crucial to the identity and to the hope that Cubans have. Now, José Martí was born in Havana in 1853 while it was still a Spanish colonial rule, and he became the intellectual architect of Cuban independence. And again, still very much revered today. I know there's statues of him all over Cuba. And what made Martí extraordinary was that he was much more than a revolutionary. He was a poet, he was a journalist, philosopher, educator, political organizer. He always put his money where his mouth was, even from a very young age, to the point where when he was a teenager, he was imprisoned by the Spanish authorities for his pro-independence beliefs. which was an experience that really shaped his lifelong commitment to freedom and justice, right? He's fighting for these freedoms, for self-determination, and he's getting imprisoned for it. Now, Marty believed that Cuba's struggle was about more than breaking away from Spain. He envisioned a democratic republic built on dignity, racial and economic equality, and national sovereignty. And he argued that Cuba should belong to all Cubans, regardless of race, class, background. He warned that true independence would require not only freedom from Spain, but also protection from foreign domination, mostly the USA. And this is where he really is an astonishing figure. I mean, this is still in the 1800s. Racism is again at its peak moment. So for him to be advocating and really putting his life on the line for racial equality, for economic equality, he's an amazing progressive thinker, even for our time period.
Yeah, he's one of the very few figures in this entire story that Cubans from both Miami and Havana agree that he was a great man. It's very rare that they're going to agree on anything for the rest of this story. But Jose Marti seems like it was just a genuinely good dude.
And why do you think that there is that agreement amongst the two different parties?
Because I think this was the
liking
first,
Jose?
like this was the moment that one Cuban decided to stand up to Spain, where it's going to get way more convoluted here because we start standing up to the United States. And then that's where our history gets all weird and stuff. But this is kind of the first like Cuban for Cuba moment. And with it being the first, it's kind of their George Washington figure. I mean, obviously he wasn't nearly as successful, but the story gets weird with the politics of the 20th century.
And I assume, well, I know we'll talk Che Guevara at some point, but is Jose Marti like the predecessor of a Che and somebody that's like admired and revered there? And yeah, okay.
I mean, I mention it at the end of Jose Marti's story, but he is referenced by Fidel Castro constantly. I mean, he's one of those figures that you can pull from if you really want to if you want to convince the Cuban people, you align what you're saying to what Jose Marti said and did. And you're almost, it's same way that a US politician would, pull from the Constitution or the founding fathers. Like he carries that much weight to where he is central to moving any sort of political or social movement within Cuba.
Wow. Yeah.
And he was a really forward thinker because again, Cuba is still Spanish, but he sees the US as what would eventually become Cuba's main antagonist. And he wrote consistently about a concept called Our America. And the whole idea behind this is that the USA is just one country of many in the Americas. And just because the United States has co-opted and taken hostage the name America, that does not give the USA special status or hold over two entire continents. You have a North and South America that spans two hemispheres, and they're inextricably linked with a shared colonial history and with a people that value individual freedom and self-determination. Every nation in North and South America has had to endure its own revolution and its own fight for freedom. And it's the USA that's just one of what Marti called Our America.
Is there no
and really
better...
for a modern example of this?
Sorry, because is there no better metaphor for America than there's 35 countries that view themselves as Americans as well, and we're just like, no, we're the Americans.
Exactly.
I have a funny story that goes like perfectly with that. This might be a good time to share it. When I was in Cuba, we were in Havana. We were at one of the like nightclubs that was not like a nightclub, like a super party nightclub. It was a dinner theater. Like you go up, there was singing, dancing, everything in there. And they were going around the room asking people, where are you from? And so they're taking the mic up to different tables and they're saying, hey, where are you from? Where are you from? You got, France, and you got everywhere across the world. They go up to an American lady in there and they say, where are you from? And she goes, America. And the place just got silent. And we were sitting there and we were just like hands, face in our hands. We're like, oh my God, could you not have said like the United States or like anything else
Literally
besides just straight up just America? And they were cheering for everybody else, and everybody else went up. And this one lady, I mean, my family, we were so embarrassed by that. We're like, we do not want to be associated there. But I mean, perfect example, right, of what like Jose Martí is talking about is this America is not just the United States. It is North and South and in this entire section of the continent here. So crazy.
Truly. Well, and it's very, very near and dear and held to close regard for the rest of the Americas. But I mean, how many, again, I'm even going to be careful of using America as like the just catch-all for the US, but like
Yeah.
how many people in the US just genuinely equate America American with just the US? So, like it really is so
It's unfortunate.
imbued in how we view the world. And and again, a modern example was Bad Bunny's Super Bowl halftime show. Honestly, like when he listed out every single nation that was in North America, that was he's calling back to what Jose Marti was really or like championing was the fact that this is our America. We are an entire hemisphere of people that have much more similarities than differences, and we need to recognize that. I just think that that's really powerful.
But how fucking
Totally.
arrogant are we, though? Like, every other country, Canadians are Canadian, like, Mexicans, Mexican. We've never had another word. We're always just been Americans. Like, from a little kid,
I know.
you're told you're an American. It's like, God, that's crazy.
PR, man.
Yeah.
PR on that.
Yeah, we won that battle.
Was Marty appreciated or revered by the United States at the time, or was this seen as somebody that we needed to look out for?
He was definitely revered. I mean, he was one of the most prominent writers of his time, and again, he's a champion for democracy. He's a champion for individual freedoms, and of course, you have people that were against him. Like there's always going to be, but and even this example here, like he had to spend a lot of his life in the United States as a political exile. Um, and he united all of the Cuban communities in places like New York, Tampa, Key West. He would raise money. He would build support. I mean, he had a massive following in the U.S. And in a lot of ways, he lived a lot of his life in the U.S. So like he's certainly Cuban and a Cuban advocate, but has deep ties to the U.S. and had a lot of friends, and a lot of his successes happened in the U.S. So he was very well known. Like I mean, he was a prominent figure, especially amongst those Cuban communities. And he would eventually create the Cuban Revolutionary Party when he was in the U.S. And his leadership transformed what was a scattered independence movement into a real coordinated national cause. And in 1894, he prepared and arranged an actual armed expedition that would begin what he thought would begin the next Cuban Revolution. Now, the downtrodden people of Cuba, emboldened by his writing and his leadership, did start that war in 1895. And in that same year, Marty would return to Cuba to join the fight. Again, he always put his money where his mouth was. He wanted to be at the head of the charge. She was. Just after weeks of landing, he was killed in the Battle of Dos Rios while he was leading a valiant charge on a white horse. Like literally, like from a
Incredible.
storybook. He's leading into battle on a white horse. He gets killed, and his death turned him into a martyr for Cuban independence and inspired thousands to continue with the struggle that he so wanted for his country. His legacy extends far beyond the battlefield. Again, he was an amazing, prolific writer for the time. He championed liberty, democracy, and really a Latin America that would be able to have self-determination. And it was Marty, as we've said, who Fidel Castro would later embody nearly a century later. It's Marty who Fidel would use as a muse and as a symbol of what it meant to fight for Cuban independence, specifically against American hegemony. In 1895, despite Marty's loss, the battle for Cuban independence would rage on, propelled by his intellectual foundation that he built. However, things are about to get turned upside down. A seemingly harmless ship called the USS Maine is stationed in Havana, and something no one saw coming is about to happen that would change the course of history forever for both Cuba and the US. But that's where we're going to pick back up next episode.
Baby, let's remember the Maine, Ikas.
Jose Marti sounds like a badass, man.
Yeah.
Truly. Again, like even for our standards, he is, I think, someone to be revered and respected for his progressive viewpoints, like true progressive. I'm not talking like party lines, but like actually when he like moves society forward in terms of equality. And he grew up with all of the history that we just talked about. He grew up amongst that and really eternalized it, and wanted to see a Cuba that America got, honestly. Like America fought for its freedom, and it was able to have self-determination. And he saw countries like Mexico doing that, Venezuela, Colombia. He just so deeply wanted a free Cuba for everyone, and I think that's always something we can respect.
Yeah, totally. And next week, we're going to get into the Spanish-American War, which Ikis and I would agree is one of the more fascinating conflicts in U.S. history that no one talks about. No one knows about it. No,
Truly.
we don't. And I think on purpose that we don't teach this one in American history. So I'm very excited to kind of go through the details of that. We're going to talk about our boy Teddy, gets a little Rough Rider action. Then things really start changing in the 20th century for Cuba. So we're going to do as much as we can to kind of share everything, but next week is going to be crazy. We got stories of war in Angola. We got fucking invasions. We got exiles in Nicaragua staging coups. Shit gets real quick, and it's awesome. I cannot wait to go through this next part with you guys.
But yeah, well,
I'm
again,
excited.
Cuba always finds itself at the extreme of whatever time period it's in the 20th century, which is the most insane century. Cuba is right there for all of it, for all the craziest things, and it is amazing.
It is impressive to think about like how many prominent figures people know about from Cuba over all of this time, but still probably don't know the in-depth history. So I'm super excited to be able to dive into that with you guys and learn that, because to what you're saying, there's a lot, and I can't wait to tie in some of the stuff that I learned when I was there and saw when I was there into what you guys are sharing, because I have some really fascinating like side stories and anecdotes that happened or that I learned about when we were there. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear all about that, Rhett. And you just to find a fascinating situation that you happen to be able to go to Cuba during like the 3 year, 2 years, whatever it was, that you could freely do that. So I'm excited to hear all about it.
Yeah, well, the reason we went, and we can share more about this in a later episode, was my dad wanted to go for his 60th birthday before it got shut back down to where the U.S. could not travel there anymore. My dad saw the writing on the wall, and he's like, we're not going to be able to do this for long. I want to go. And so we were there in 2018, and that was one of like the last times. But even going then, I don't want to tell too much here, but I got like harassed by U.S. Border Patrol coming back, or Border Customs coming back. And they kept asking me, like, why were you in Cuba? And we were coached to say we were there for the support of the Cuban people. And the guy was like, what does that mean? And I was like, to support the Cuban people. And he's like, yeah, but what were you doing there? Yeah, so like even in 2018, like being a white boy coming back from Cuba, like I was getting grilled as a 20 whatever some year old. So yeah, I'm excited to kind of share some stories that go further than that.
Yeah. Well, ultimately at the end of this series, I hope that we are able to answer why. Why is it like that? Why is this the relationship we have with this country that is so fascinating? So that's a great preface.
Love it. All right, we got to continue the trend. What's still good in the world? What do we got on our minds for today?
Well, I started this morning. I saw that there's an Ebola outbreak. So I was like, well, thank God USAID is there to help. Oh, wait. So I had to get rid of that one. So I'm going to go with...
We're talking about what's good in the world.
Yeah, I know. So I'm going to go with just the American people doing funny ass shit. I'm pretty sure if the New York Knicks win the NBA title, that city might burn to the ground. Those people, I've never seen passion like this. And like, I am not a New York fan. I don't give a shit about, East Coast sports, but I'm sort of pulling for New Yorkers to win that one because I think the party is going to be epic. So you know what? That's some good about America. Even though we are a weird people, holy shit, when we get passionate, we burn down our own cities, and it's going to be awesome.
And everybody's doing it too. It is the collective of New York that is out there. It is not a certain part of the population. It is everybody in New York is out on the streets celebrating, and it is awesome.
Well, boys, June is a big month for celebrating different communities. Of course, it's Pride Month, so happy Pride Month to all our LGBTQ friends out there. But June is also Caribbean American Heritage Month, very on brand for our series today. So I think that's really cool. I think we should all take some time to celebrate. reflect on the music, food, language, art, and obviously the history that we just learned of what the Caribbean has brought to the U.S. and to the world, because it really is underappreciated. So I think that's great. That needs to be celebrated more. Like a Caribbean Heritage Month is a great thing. We need to continue it.
Absolutely.
Love it.
So get a pina colada, enjoy yourself, people.
Please.
Make a Cuba Libre, man. There you go. It's Coke and rum. There you go.
There you go. Love it.
All right, my what's so good in the world is not necessarily like a current event. It's funny, every week or every time we record one of these, I dwell on what's still good in the world, and you can obviously go Google like good news, but I'm like, how to make that relevant, right? And how to make that personal to us. I'll say this, that when I was in Cuba, I was talking to somebody and one of the locals there, and what he said to me was just super profound. And I'll probably reference this a few times throughout this journey, but he said, I am so glad you're here. People are people. I respect you, and the government is the government. That is not us. I know that is not you. I'm happy that you're here as person to person. And that has just stuck with me over these years. It was maybe one of the most like profound moments that I've had in traveling, to be completely honest, because that does filter into like life and how we should treat life day to day, is that like people are people, government's government, be there for your person. And so I was kind of trying to wrap all that up into just like community and talking to people, and like people are awesome. So don't forget that, what you see in the news, what's going on and the polarizing things out there. Cameron, to your point about the Knicks and all the people in New York being in the streets, like people are awesome, and people together are strong. And so that's kind of my good in the world tied to this episode of what I learned through spending some time in Cuba.
Awesome.
Beautifully put. Yeah, it's amazing.
Love it.
All right, boys. Well, good work.
We got some. Yeah, great work, guys. Ikis, way to
we did it.
Way to spearhead quite a staunch look at history in Cuba there, and a meaty topic. So
yep, we're just getting started.
Much more to come.
Yeah.
That was 2 hours, and we got a lot more.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now that we have context, so let's get onto the story.
Just a little context.
All right. Love it. All right, guys. We'll see you next time.
All right.
See y'all.
Boys.